So, dear guests, we would like to thank you. We're inexpressibly grateful that you found time to join us today for our panel discussion. And it's really important to discuss these issues. And I think that in our Ukrainian national feed, it's not really covered how different regions perceive our struggle against the Russian aggression. And I would like to introduce our moderator for today, who is Dr. Maxim Yakovlyev, before we start. So Dr. Maxim Yakovlyev is the head of the International Relations Department, an associate professor at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and a director of the School for Policy Analysis, our beloved university think tank, jointly with which we're delighted to organize this event. He holds a Ph.D. in political science, having been trained in social policy analysis and research methods at such flagship institutions as Oxford University under Chevening Scholarship and Friedrich Schiller Universität Jena under DAAD Scholarship. Dr. Yakovlev has a continuous 14-year tenure as a course instructor in quantitative and qualitative research methods in policy analysis, political science, and sociology, to which he extensively devoted his more than 50 publications in academic journals. Additionally, he was a visiting scholar and guest lecturer at Kamenius University of Bratislava and is prominent in media both inside and outside as a commentator of Ukrainian and global politics. Besides, Dr. Yakovlev has been active in translating books into Ukrainian language. In January of this year, his own book, Conspiracy Theories, How Not to Become a Conspiracy Theorist, was published, and we urge everyone to read it if you have a sufficient level of command in Ukrainian. Without further ado, Dr. Maxim Yakovlev, the floor is yours.
Kirill, thank you very much. I would kindly ask Hanna to mute her phone, microphone, because otherwise there are some interesting noise of something unzipping there. So I would kindly ask the moderators to mute those who did not mute the microphones. Thank you. Okay, again, thank you very much for inviting me. It is really an honor and a pleasure to moderate such an interesting discussion because of two factors. First, the topic is very interesting, of course, and we are approaching the 24th of February fast, which would mark the first year of Russian war against Ukraine. And secondly, I'm honored to moderate a panel with wonderful panelists, whom I will now have the pleasure to introduce because I received very nice biographies and I got to know much more even about people I knew beforehand. So that would be very nice. So as a moderator, I will proceed the following way. I will introduce our panelists. Not all of them will join right away. Two of them are already there and one will join a bit later, but I will still introduce her. Then as a following discussion, I would just briefly mention that our panelists received the questions. I will not read all of them because there was at least 7 to each of them, but just mention briefly what they were asked to prepare for discussion. And then we will proceed to our discussion, meaning inputs, comments. You are also welcome to write your comments and questions maybe, so that we will have an interacting and free-flowing discussion. Okay, so I will now switch to the biographies to be able to read it because I am afraid of missing out some interesting information. And it is my pleasure, and I would love to start with introducing Professor Katri Pynnöniemi. Katri is an associate professor at the University of Helsinki Alexander Institute, and she holds Mannerheim Chair of Russian Security Studies. The joint professorship between the University of Helsinki and the National Defense University was established in August 2017. Katri Pynnöniemi holds master's and doctor's degrees in international relations from the University of Tampere in Finland. Previously, Katri has worked as a senior researcher at the Finnish Institute for International Affairs. She has been a visiting researcher at a number of universities, namely University of Tartu, Estonia in 2012, Swedish Institute of International Affairs in Stockholm in 2016, and at the Wilson Center of Kennan Institute and Kennan Institute, I guess, Washington, D.C. in 2017. She's also a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for Defense. I like the acronym MATINE, sounds very French to me. Katri has published widely on the system change in Russia and on Russian foreign and security policy. Her current research deals with Russia's strategic thinking, which I guess is very interesting, especially in our case and for the topic of our discussion, focusing in her research in particular on narratives shaping public perception of Russia's war against Ukraine, Russian military thought and analysis of military threats. The latest publications include edited book Nexus of Patriotism and Militarism in Russia, Quest for Internal Unity, published by Helsinki University Press in 2021. The Kremlin War Rhetoric, published by Cosmopolis, 2022. Perception of hybrid war in Russia, means, targets, and objectives identified in the Russian debate, Cambridge Review International Affairs, 2020. Russia's national security strategy, analysis, conceptual evolution, Journal of Slavic Military Studies, 2018. I hope now everybody is more than convinced that Katri is a very good choice to discuss this issue with all of us. So Katri, thank you for joining us. And
thank you so much for invitation.
Thank you. And I would like to move to presenting the next panelist we have, retired Captain Cheng Xu. Cheng Xu is a lecturer and Ph.D. candidate at the Political Science Department of the University of Toronto in Canada. His doctoral thesis aims to develop a theory of the impacts of social relations on insurgent mobilization and civil war outcomes with a focus on the Philippines and Southeast Asia. Besides that, Mr. Xu is an ambassador of the International Institute of Genocide and Human Rights. He recently served as a senior policy analyst with Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs. He's also a former Canadian Armed Forces infantry officer and paratrooper with the 3rd Battalion Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. In 2014, he deployed on Roto Zero of Operation Reassurance in Central and Eastern Europe. So Mr. Xu is now, as we guess from this description, is familiar with Central and Eastern Europe, which is great to have him. The central topics of his research: insurgency movements, civil wars, mass political violence, genocide, and ethnic conflict. Basically everything Russia does now in Ukraine. He wrote extensively on indigenous and ethnic minorities in Southeast Asia, insurgent fragmentation in the Philippines, peace building, counterinsurgents as a genocide instrument, and comparative analysis of nationalism and genocide in Nazi Germany, Showa Japan, and fascist Italy. Fascinating topics. It's great to have Captain Xu with us. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Last but not least, dear colleague of mine who will join us a bit later because of her other commitments this morning, Ms. Solomia Borshos. Solomia Borshos is the executive director of the Ukrainian Institute. She's a member of the ACCA, London, UK, and holds a master's degree in law from Ivan Franko National University of Lviv, Ukraine, and a master's degree in international relations from the War Studies Department at King's College London, United Kingdom. Borshos specializes in culture and public diplomacy in civil society, steadily working in that direction since 2013. Thematically, her work is related to democracy, peace building, good governance, and independent media. Previously, she held the position of Deputy General Director for Development at Mistecki Arsenal, Ukraine's flagship contemporary art museum from 2017 to 2019, engaged in civil society initiatives such as the founding of Hromadske UA, an independent media outlet, which I definitely encourage everybody to follow, and because they do great podcasts, they interview a lot of interesting people, including me, which is nice. So that's why I would definitely recommend to follow. Additionally, Solomia worked as a consultant and researcher for various organizations, including United Nations Development Programme and Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. Her work focused on civil society and human rights, post-conflict development, and democratization. Having introduced all of our distinguished panelists, I think we can now proceed to actually start our discussion. As I spoiled a bit the topic, I told that our guests received a number of questions because I do see the list of questions, and everyone received 7 of them, and Solomia was even bothered with 8. I will not read through all of them, but mention what types of questions they received. They were, for example, because I would kindly ask then maybe Katri to start and then Mr. Xu to proceed. The questions are around the perception in Finland of this war that Russia initiated with Ukraine, and this perception relates to the threat, how the Finnish society perceive the threats. Definitely would like to hear about the Finnish stance of this Russian war against Ukraine, maybe about scenarios that are desired by the Finnish society. Maybe Katri would elaborate more on the threat perception and changes in the threat perceptions, especially Helsinki-Brussels dyadic relationship, if any. Maybe some permutations in the Nordic Council, or definitely in the North, Scandinavia generally then. Maybe something about effects of regionalism as such. And of course, a question of how Finland and the European Union, if they can facilitate Ukraine's victory over Russia. So Katri, the floor is yours. Please, you can make your introduction or contribution.
Yes, thank you very much for this very important and very thorough questions. And I think they are on very topical and on spot on. I would like to start with the change in threat perception. For me, as a researcher of Russia's strategic thinking, and especially researcher focusing on how Russia sees the world, it's been in a way clear that there is this huge divide in how the Russian elites, how the Russian public sees threats around it, and those that are relevant for general public or the politicians in European member states, including Finland. But to actually answer the first question, I'd like to say that yes, there is a big change in Finland on threats in Europe, military threats in Europe. But on the other hand, when we look more closely, the issue, it's not that surprising. And now I'm trying to explain what I mean by this. So maybe first say that if we look at what happened in the Finnish policy making and Finnish relations with Russia in 2014, and then compare it to 2022, there is a clear and important difference. So now with 2022 and the open massive aggression, it led to the open acknowledgement of Russia's total impossibility of having any dialogue with the Russian regime in a way, and then it led to this big change in Finnish non-alignment, militarily non-alignment policy. But then if we look the historical background, we see that the historical experience of Finland has sort of affected Finnish defense policy, meaning that we have built resilience or built a comprehensive defense against the possibility of a Russian attack, meaning that the defense forces of Finland have been, I wouldn't say always prioritized in a way that the military would like to have, but the fact that we have general conscription and now with the possibility of NATO membership, Finland is considered as an asset into the alliance. It tells you a lot. So on the background of everything in Finnish policy towards Russia, there has been this acknowledgement that we have to have a capable military, as capable as possible for the small country. But then when it comes to the political side, even after 2014, when Finland, as part of the EU, was part of the EU policies, meaning restrictions on cooperation with Russia, sanctions, other sort of measures aiming to, in a way, tell to Russia that this was the military operation in Crimea was out of the borders of what is acceptable. Even then, our kind of active stability policy, aktiivinen vakauspolitiikka in Finnish, active stability policy continued, and there were these big investments made by the Finnish companies to Russian economy. There was even an agreement on nuclear power plant to be built in Finland. So there was this idea that Finland can continue with its some part of its politics with Russia, even though there was an active war going on in eastern part of Ukraine and occupation of Crimea. And I, as a researcher, remember very well that it was quite difficult there was not such a similar agreement of what's going on, like what kind of terms to use to describe what is happening in Ukraine. In that sense, and then when we, as a researchers in 2016, there was a lot of research done by research community, kind of outlining different kind of risks that the change in Russia, in a way, due to this starting of the conflict, would have also for Finland, and there was quite a strong backlash against this. So, in a nutshell, there is always the perception of threat from the east, but then at the same time, due to our historical experiences, there has been this idea of maintaining some sort of a dialogue with the Moscow. But this changed dramatically actually on the very day of the massive attack. And it was kind of expressed by the Finnish president that masks has come off, meaning that there is no longer any pretense of any dialogue. We sort of now see clearly that Russia is country of aggressor country. And after that, the business has left. There's no energy relations, and the NATO process started actually by the people rather than led by the politicians. That's important. But as a researcher, I have to say that it feels not enough to say at the moment of this attack that masks are off. It should have been said far more earlier, and also there should have been much more by the European countries to try to prevent the war. But here, of course, we are with the dilemma how to deal with the regime that is clearly not interested of any dialogue, and maybe the pretending that there is this sort of some sort of a conversations with the Russian leadership was self-deception. But this is in a way discussion that it is important that we have it and we kind of realize where the mistakes were made, but it's not maybe helpful to the full extent. So what I want to emphasize is that the idea of that we could somehow solve these problems by the way it was in the way that Finnish policy was oriented towards Russia via dialogue, it's not there anymore. And then to answer one of the important questions is that there is very strong consensus that it's via helping Ukraine to defend itself that we can help to restore peace in Europe. How this war ends will have a very strong effect also to European, Northern European, and in general European security. So therefore, there is this consensus now very strongly to help Ukraine in all possible ways. But maybe I stop here before going to Nordic. We can kind of come back to it later after others have been able to say their starting points. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Katri, for your contribution. I would like to welcome Solomia Borshos, who has joined us. And she joined us without microphone switched off. So Solomia, thank you to have you. It's great to have you with us. So we decided that we're going to proceed one by one. So it was Katri's contribution. But I like that Katri started with a divide in threat perception, especially about the European Union, maybe in general, because you know the Russians that Kremlin misuses this term, the collective West, under which they mean this like definite, the general enemy of Russia. And also, of course, the change of this military non-alignment status of Finland. I would just add for myself, it doesn't mean that Finland has ever seen itself as a Soviet country or something. So that's definitely a different idea of the security and changes in this perception. And of course, I like that Katri stressed that it is a great question how to deal with a regime, Putin's regime, that is pretending to make peace with this collective West. But in reality, it does nothing apart from pursuing its own neo-imperial and aggressive foreign goals. This is another point. But definitely we'll come then to this regional question of Nordic countries after maybe this like first round of contributions. And now I will open the interesting file with questions that Captain Xu received. Because the questions that Captain Xu received, they were about the threat perception in the Southeast Asian nations and how they changed with the initiation of the Russian war against Ukraine last year. Maybe a bit about general trends in this threat perceptions of Southeast Asian countries, scope of Russia's presence in Southeast Asian politics, something when Ukraine very often are not familiar with the operations of Asian and was the operations affected by the Russian invasion? Maybe how the 17 tragedy in 2014 it changed somehow Indonesia's standpoint of the Russian war against Ukraine, and how this strategy in Indonesia maybe to influence the regional context somehow. Maybe if we Ukrainians can expect some diplomatic or even military support or aid from Southeast Asia. And of course, a very difficult question about our diplomatic presence and the voice of Ukraine, how it can be heard in Southeast Asia, because you know this, we'll regularly hear this great words about, you know, global South and that Ukraine needs to be present, but maybe something from your practical experience or perspective, how can Ukrainian voice be heard in that region? So Captain Xu, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Maxim, for presenting those questions. And I also want to say, just for the record too, I'm so happy to be invited by my two former students, Carrillo and Ellie. I don't know if she's on the line, but while we have the video recording going, I just want to state for the record that they were my two top performing students in that class. And so here I am just putting them on the spot, and I'm very thankful for their invitation. And so I just want to start with just a little bit of reflection on the Southeast Asian experience in comparison to the contributions that Katri just made regarding Finland's experience with regards to threat perception, because I actually thought that there were some really interesting points of comparison here, particularly with this the influence of history and geography in terms of how it shapes the threat perception of different countries vis-a-vis the relationship with Russia. Specifically, you know, the Finnish experience has kind of pushed this non-alignment orientation for a while, but as she mentioned, the mask started to come off when the real aggressive phase of Russian incursion really started. And I think in Southeast Asia, this is somewhat of a trend that we're also starting to see. Just to give a little bit of context, the general threat perception for Southeast Asian countries as a region is not so much Russia, but China, of course. Southeast Asia, of course, exists in the shadow of China. And so from a historical perspective, in order to balance against the perceived threat that China might present to some of these countries, a lot of Southeast Asian countries have really align themselves with the West. However, this alignment is also somewhat fraught, given some of the history of interference, of Western interference in Southeast Asian politics. So for instance, there's still some hangover in the Philippines, where I am right now, about the US support of a former dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who is the father of the current president, of the American support for that particular regime. There's also, of course, some hangovers from the Vietnam War in Indochina. And so given some of this fraught relationship with the US, Russia is kind of seen as a third alternative. So this goes to explain a little bit about the lukewarm responses that Southeast Asian countries have given, and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as a political bloc, has given to the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. You know, even with the G20 summit that was held in Indonesia was extremely awkward, because this idea that that ASEAN as a bloc refuses to condemn in strong terms the invasion was really just hanging over the whole meeting, which Indonesia really wanted to be a success. And Indonesia for a very long time really tried to canvass itself as this arbiter and potentially a mediator in the conflict. But of course, this really didn't go anywhere, because they really didn't want to move from their position of quote unquote neutrality in this instance. And so given that Southeast Asian countries are kind of existing in the shadow of geopolitical competition, particularly between China and the US, we really saw in the last decade that Russia is really starting to make a lot of inroads in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, particularly with respect to arms exports as well as energy exports to the region, because in some cases, countries were really feeling suspicious of China's Belt and Road initiatives. And in other cases, they also don't want to become overly dependent on the US and their traditional Western allies. So Russia was really seen as this viable alternative. And if you kind of even divide up Southeast Asia kind of by region, so we have the mainland Indochina region in Southeast Asia, and then of course you have the archipelago of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, you really actually see a pretty big contrast in the way that they have approached it. So for instance, in Indochina is really where you see quite strong support for Russia, or at least refusal to condemn Russia on the international stage, such as at the UN General Assembly. And this, of course, makes a lot of sense to us when we look at countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, which have historically had very strong ties with Russia. And I was in a conversation with the former Secretary General of ASEAN, and I really asked him, I really tried to press him on this. And I said, you know, I think Southeast Asian countries should really see Ukrainians as kindred, because they too are existing on the shadows and sometimes even bordering who they perceive to be a very aggressive, greater power. So why is it that they are not taking the stands with the Ukrainians, who should be their brothers and sisters? And one of the things that the former Secretary General, you know, he said, if you look at a country, for instance, like Vietnam, which has a lot of influence in ASEAN, you know, the cohort of the Communist Party leadership still feel very strong loyalty and ties to Russia, given their historical experiences and, of course, the way in which that regime developed through the experience of the Vietnam War and the unification of Vietnam. And similarly, if you look at a country like, for instance, Myanmar, it will, given the military junta and committing mass human rights abuses within its own territory, will of course not condemn Russia, and is in many ways reliant on Russia for military aid and military support. Now, if we shift our lens over to the archipelago portion of Southeast Asia, you really kind of see a much more complex picture, because these societies are so diverse that there is not really one voice that can be put out there, whether that's in strong support of Ukraine or strong support for Russia. And particularly because there is a lot of competing narratives within these countries as well. The one exception I can say is Singapore. Singapore has come out very, very strongly. It has, in fact, placed its own sanctions on Russia. But if you look at a country like Philippines, for instance, so one of the things that you really get to appreciate here, particularly with the previous presidency of President Duterte, is that, you know, a large section of Filipino society finds this strongman leadership style of somebody like Vladimir Putin to be actually quite appealing. For them, because society can seem very fractured and has many factions, that it takes a strong leader, somebody like Putin, to use an iron fist to unite everybody. So that actually is a perception of many, many people here. However, I would say that this perception is gradually shifting, and it has been shifting in the last year since the invasion. So one of the key things that we can look at is, for instance, in the Philippines, there was this arms deal with Russia to buy Russian military helicopters. This deal had recently been canceled, and instead the Philippines have opted to purchase American equipment instead. So I think that's a positive sign to show the changing perceptions. Another really interesting observation that I had, and I actually had this recently, you know, as you mentioned in the introduction, my research is on rebel movements and insurgent mobilization. And I was actually in conversation with a former rebel actually last week. And we started talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I really wanted to understand, you know, I know that, you know, you're kind of preoccupied with a lot of the things that you're doing here, but what is your perception of what is going on over there? And I think it's very telling what this person said to me, because he said, you know, we absolutely believe that Ukraine has the right and they must defend their own sovereignty. It is existential. And that is something that we can absolutely relate to, because for these movements, they are also trying to assert their sovereignty and self-determination. But very interestingly, the caveat that this person put to me was they still believe to some extent that there is this Western, so American puppet master behind the scenes, somehow still pulling the strings. And, you know, that is like a very pervasive perception here, that US imperialism, because of their experiences here, is somehow still at play with regards to its engagement and NATO's engagement with Ukraine in respects to this invasion. And so, so it's this like very dichotomous perception of threat. I think another thing that's really pushing Southeast Asia in kind of generally in the direction of starting to move away from Russia too, is this recognition that they too should not be overly reliant and dependent on Russian energy once they really saw how fragile the supply chains are, especially when it comes to energy and food security. When they saw the fragility in the supply chain, I think a lot of them, particularly when they're battling huge inflations and food security issues, they're really starting to see that it is not in their interest to throw their weight behind Russia or to remain that really non-aligned stance here. And of course, this is not even getting into the discussion on cybersecurity. here in the Philippines, cybersecurity is a massive, massive issue, particularly when it comes to things like influencing operations through social media, and the way in which Russia is really engaging in cyber warfare in Ukraine, I think is also causing concerns that this is going to open up a Pandora's box that's going to leave countries that don't have sophisticated and the most latest cybersecurity infrastructure more vulnerable, because now you're really letting these agents out in the wild. Some other positive indications. I actually just saw on the news today that the Ukrainian Charge d'Affaires to Malaysia has promised that there will be a mission, an embassy established in the Philippines and vice versa. So I take this as an extremely, extremely positive move in the direction of really recognizing that you can't really remain neutral in this types of situations. When there is a clear aggressor, neutrality is it's a myth. And that you know, we've in the Philippines specifically, they've really come a long way from President Duterte really singing Putin's praises to starting to cut off some of these established ties and really to kind of start to establish cultural relations and diplomatic relations with Ukraine.
You see, I even decided to take some notes not by hand, but typing them, which is because I like this, that you really paid attention to the changes in our foreign policy. Apart from South Asia, we're all discussing in Ukraine 10 new embassies in Africa, for example. And it's interesting that diplomatic mission relations are so important. We now realize that they're even more important than we thought they were. And I like that you mentioned, Captain Xu, this interesting thing that we're not many in Ukraine are actually familiar with, that relations with Russia as a balance to a real threat of China, and China is seen as a more powerful and real enemy. So, of course, the American support for different regimes in Southeast Asia and also other places in the world, we can speak about Latin America in that regard, and how that influences the perception of America, the United States' role in this war. And as you said, there's an interesting example about American puppet masters pulling the strings behind what is going on with this war. As Kirilo said in introduction, I published recently a book on conspiracy theories in Ukrainian, and this is something, of course, a conspiracist worldview that behind everything there is a puppet master, be it American imperialist or Russians or someone else. This is something we as international relations scholars have to deal with all the time. And as I realize now from our conversation, be it Southeast Asia, Ukraine, Europe, or elsewhere in the world. So this is something that was interesting to hear. Of course, interesting idea about Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the experience of strong historic ties with what is now Russia, and then counterbalance with China, and then how we Ukrainians can pursue our narrative, saying that, you see, you can, because they can definitely relate to having an aggressive neighbor that can have influence and also threaten the sovereignty. This is really interesting. Of course, example of Singapore, where Ukraine really admire this small nation. Interesting. Good that you mentioned this idea, because I'm always struggling with this thing that, you know, this narrative, we need a strong leader with a strong iron fist, and he or she will bring us to the happy future. It sounds extremely Soviet style thing, but if it's something that, especially for societies that are, you know, with many divides within them and many cleavages, I do understand why these messages, why they land well with them. Interesting was the canceling deal with Russians for buying the helicopters and switching to the American suppliers. My top of the mind comment would be that the battlefields in Ukraine show that Russian military producers are not always good at what they produce, which we Ukrainians prove technically on the battlefield. So I know, Captain, you will definitely have some more to contribute, so that we can, of course, and last thing about how reliable Russia is as supplier of both energy and food. We realized that, especially in Europe, and now finally the Western European countries also realized that Russia always used energy as a weapon, and energy transit and energy resource as a weapon. So, and it was interesting to hear about the cybersecurity in Philippines. I didn't know there was a huge issue. That was really interesting contribution. Thank you, Captain Shu. We'll continue our discussion, and I'm glad that Solomia finally joined us. Solomia, I read your biography, which was brilliant and impressive. I will now shortly tell the audience about the questions that you received. So what is the place of Ukrainian studies? And this is very interesting because from Captain Shu, we heard about the perception of Ukraine in Southeast Asia, and especially in the global academia after the initiation of the war. Maybe some strategic and tactical priorities of the Ukrainian Institute of Ukrainian Cultural Diplomacy, the whole. Maybe you would also elaborate more, and there was mentioned already, regions that are the least covered by Ukraine's diplomatic mission, and what can be called the Russia's sphere of influence. How can we persuade the majority of global South to act in favor of Ukraine? Maybe the role of Ukrainian diaspora and expats in Ukrainian cultural diplomacy. The recognition of Holodomor as a genocide, how it proceeds, why there are not as many countries we would expect to recognize it. Maybe something, some countries that you find interesting in terms of cultural diplomacy and relevant examples for Ukraine. And of course, about Duolingo Ukrainian language course and basic interest in Ukrainian culture and definitely in Ukrainian language. So that would be very nice to hear your contribution, Solomia, to shift a bit the topic to Ukrainian perspective, and then colleagues, we can proceed to questions, maybe the second round. Okay, Solomia, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Maxim, and thank you both Katri and Shani for what you have said. I haven't heard Katri much because I was late, and I apologize for that, but I definitely took notes as well after your chiming presentation. It's really helpful, and that's what we are focusing as well. And now the world, not only Europe, and it's really relevant for us as well. So trying to address all the questions from the students and participants that I've got, I'll just introduce maybe a bit the Ukrainian Institute and really like strategic things that we are doing, just for you to have a context. The Ukrainian Institute is a public agency, was created in 2017. So we are into 6 years of operations now in Ukraine. Quite a young institution of public cultural diplomacy in comparison to British Council, almost 95 years, or Goethe Institute. But these are definitely our vis-a-vis more popular than us. The Ukrainian Institute generally belongs to that type of cultural diplomacy in its more pure state, whilst, as you might know, maybe from Maxim, your professor, from somewhere else from other professors, that there are many types of how the nations cooperate on cultural level. So there are also the public diplomacy approach, rather relevant to the US, to Korea. There are also cultural relations focus, which is more and more popular in the Western part of Europe. That has been taken by the UK, by the EU as multinational body, and by Goethe Institute, by Germany as well. So what is the difference? Just let me explain, and let me explain where we stand here. The public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy is clearly more dictated by the public agency, the usually Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the institutions are usually created within the ecosystem of Ministry of Foreign Affairs and kind of have an agenda of the state. It doesn't mean it's negative. It doesn't mean it's toxic, but it's kind of very much approved, confirmed by the state. Whilst cultural relations approach, which is becoming more and more popular over the last 2-3 decades, is something where you rather focus on how you create dialogue, not how you present your culture yourself, but how you kind of try to hear each other in the dialogue. And usually the institutions within the cultural relations framework are more arm's-length institutions, which means they are more independent in their operations. The Ukrainian case, theoretically, is rather cultural diplomacy, which is like in between. We are trying in our approaches to be pro-dialogue, because we see that, and we are actually fully convinced in that it doesn't play well when you show your beautiful culture. Well, all cultures are beautiful, right? So let us not talk only about the beauty of Vyshyvanka, whilst the Indian, for example, culture is so rich as well, right? So we are very much pro-dialogue within the institution, and I hope it will be after I quit and I choose other career directions. But also we are also working within the system of MFA, and we sometimes in very strategic narratives, especially during the first months of the war, of the Great War, I mean 2022, we quite closely worked on, okay, which narratives do we have to address in Germany, in France? Why do we need that? Of course, for the better support of Ukraine and so on. So just for you to know, we are on this in between the two types of the cultural diplomacy. Also, you asked me, and thank you for the language question. I will address it as well. Even though we are intuitively into language courses, because that's what the British Council and Goethe Institute have been doing for 30 years in Ukraine. So if you think about the Cultural Diplomacy Institutes in Kyiv, you would rather think about language courses. But statistically, all over the globe, it's not the case. The language courses are comparatively less numerous in terms of projects, comparison to general educational projects, arts and culture projects, and like that. British Council, having said that, British Council and Goethe Institute still have focus on language. That's true. But I just want you to to make some ties to the Swedish Institute, to the institutes beyond our general thinking about the cultural diplomacy. We do not have it, I'll tell you directly, we do not have this essay direction, even though we plan to have that. Just for for the Ukrainian constants and students, just for you to know, there is a National Commission on Standardization of the Ukrainian language. That is, by law, is the first subject body, public body to work with the language. So for the Ukrainian Institute, and for in order to serve your interests as Ukrainians, we need to cooperate between the Ministry of Education, between this commission and with ourselves. So that is why it is becoming complex, to be honest. And organizationally, obviously, it's much easier for us when we do projects which are fully dependent on us. If something is more complex in terms of legislation or bodies that are responsible for that, we know that it's becoming more difficult. But we do agree with you fully, 100% about the need to set up the courses around the world, especially around Europe. Which leads me to strategic directions of the Ukrainian Institute. You asked me the questions about the world, the globe, and that's really exciting. I must say, though, that we reasonably still will focus as the Ukrainian Institute on the Euro-Atlantic community that we call in Ukraine. Why it is important? Because first of all, politically, there are our allies, and that has been confirmed over the weekend at the Munich conference by Joe Biden at the speech, and so on and so forth. And this really is still and will be, because we are also neighbors, right, and part of one Europe. But what has changed a bit is deepening of what we are doing. Whilst we want to be understood by the world, that's something that had been relevant in Europe 5 years ago. We wanted to be understood. So this is the task and objective for the whole of the world now. In Europe, we want to gradually become European themselves. Like in Ukraine, we call свої. We want to become, in the perception of Europeans, Ukrainians, or definitely they are part of Europe. Even though we are, much more we are improving our stakes in our status in the minds of the Europeans over the last 13 months, but there is still a long way to go. in order to, for any European, at least like absolute majority, to understand, okay, if something is happening in Ukraine, it means that it will touch my life sooner or later. It is changing, especially the recent polls you might have seen in the media about is the Ukraine, what is still called Ukraine's war, is it relating to my life and so on. Most of Europeans say yes. But what we also want to do is for Europeans to understand that Ukraine is coming back to Europe. It is not like, inventing itself, it's reinventing itself in Europe, because the culture by nature is very much European. That's about language. We will try to do that, but it's not going that you'll see the news tomorrow that the language course has been open. It has becoming more, it is becoming more and more important in terms of working with diaspora. And this is another question of yours. Who is diaspora for us? Let me say you also very direct truth. The diaspora in our strategy, the first strategy of the Ukrainian Institute for the 5 years period, wasn't in the focus. Why we thought like that? Okay, we have limited resources. It's around that something we had a little bit more than $1 million for the whole year. So it's a super tiny, in terms of money, it's a super tiny institution. However, if we have 50 people working with us, and we have also a lot of people that are ready to do it in terms of grant, partnership and so on. So the projects, like especially the number that we realized in last year was just enormous. It was more than 130 projects, but the budget is still very low. Even though, having said that, I understand, and we all also understand, that diaspora is becoming more and more important in terms of how we will work as a state with them. So there are a few directions that will be like strategies that will be, I think, unfolded in the future. The first one, and that's where like my circle of decisions is that we will perceive and we will cooperate with diaspora as our stakeholder type partner. What I mean, diaspora in actually all over the globe is very active, like most of diaspora. Of course, there are different waves of diaspora. Some are not active, some are not, some are ethnically leaning, some are rather like contemporaryist and more global thinking people. They are very different. But in general, we may say, and we may have a statement that the Ukrainian diaspora usually is very active in where they live. So usually we work with them shoulder to shoulder. We like have them not as the focused, like the audience, the target audience. We have them as something who will work with. And I think we'll proceed with that in the future as well. Also, and this is something rather that maybe also recalls the activities of Olena Zelenska Foundation, of Olena Zelenska Office in general, of the President in general, because it's and the MFA in general, because it's already quite a high stake there, is that very sobering truth that we are also to accept at some point. Some percentage of people that have left as refugees in 2022 will not be back. The question is, how many people will be there? But there is not a question if there will be anyone staying in Germany, in France, in Poland, and so on. And I am absolutely convinced that there should be a new strategy developed, a strategy for the war period and a strategy for the post-war period. And it's not only for 5 years. Director General, listen, Volodya, we are thinking about the strategies for 5 years. This is a bullshit. We need to think about the Ukrainian Institute in terms of 30 years period. The impact is there because that is how culture works. It's not about 5 years. So anyway, coming back to that, we need to think about diaspora in terms of how it will be in 2055, what it will be. And this is something that we at the Ukrainian Institute are also like trying, already, actually not trying, but already are speaking up. The question is whether this strategy will be, publicly discussed, will be this document or not, in which format. I don't know yet, but this is something where the specialists are already discussing. I myself, by the way, I am the graduate of the International Relations program, and my master's thesis was the political activities of the Ukrainian diaspora, how it helped during the Obama administration. So I'm super into that, because diaspora is a super important and active political and very political agent in Ukraine for the Ukrainian politics. Yes, but so far so good. We are partners. What is the focus? And it is something related also to when you have a enterprise, like company, as we lead with Volodya, we need to understand who to focus. You cannot focus you cannot target everyone. That's what we understand. What we understand, we can target those who impact others, who have impact on others. These are professional in arts, these are writers, these are intellectuals, these are academia, and so on. These are people that we are targeting. Sometimes, maybe you've heard, sometimes we are being criticized for not being super popular, for not targeting a lot of audiences. This is quite a reasonable comment and critique, I agree. But at the end of the day, you have 50 people and you have a budget. And you understand, okay, what's your strategy? Where will you win the most? What is your, where will be the highest margin of your, benefits which you will get? That is why we are focusing on those who influence others. Having said that, we will also, and this is something you didn't ask, but I do urge you to follow us on that topic. We are also thinking about being more present. Meaning having project offices in the capitals all over the world. Again, these are not the US or the UK reality. These are not big project offices. These are 3-4 people at most, but this is something that we need to do. I'll tell you an example of a German project office that is opening in late March this year. If you're in Berlin, you're welcome. Please write me an email. I'll send you an invitation, and there will be an opening event of our project office. What it means? Ukraine had been isolated from the rest of the world by the Iron Curtain for many years. Ukraine, for the last 30 years, have been focusing mostly on itself. We haven't been super active on a international arena. We have been active enough. I cannot say that, but we also understand that our internal expertise and habits on how we work with the other countries needs to be developed. And in order to understand how German society works, what it means for Ukrainian diplomacy, we need to be there, present and speaking and understanding from the inside. And that is why we are opening, this year we will open 2 project offices, maybe with the years to come, there will be more. So Berlin and Paris, follow us on that. Coming back, not back, but coming to the academia.
Solomia, maybe you would add something during the second round. I'm glad that the Ukrainian participant speaks the most, but we will have definitely now the second round of discussion where you'll be able to contribute.
Yes, I can tell about the academia, the Ukrainian studies in the second round. I think it makes sense because it's quite a different, an important topic as well. Yeah.
And I think as Ukrainians, we need to make a good impression that we're not stealing everybody's time, and we can also give them the floor for the discussion, of course. Okay, this is my contribution as the moderator. Okay, colleagues, I think now with Solomia told us basically reported on her activities, I think any executive director would do the same, telling and praising her institution, which was great, and we heard a lot about that. Now, coming back to our question about the Russian war against Ukraine and the impact it had, we heard that Katri already did some sort of spoiler, telling that she would like to proceed to the Nordic countries and to the regionalism. Generally, she had something to contribute on that. Captain Xu, maybe a question to you, because we are definitely calling for participants now to write your questions in the chat. It's available to you. But maybe, Captain Xu, the question to you, Meanwhile, Katri is presenting here for the second round of contribution ideas on the Nordic countries and the changes in perception. What Ukraine can do in order for our voice to be heard in Southeast Asian countries, because they are so diverse. Maybe you would have come up with some ideas regarding some particular countries, something like that. And then Solomia she already told us, will contribute to the academic activities. Okay, so, if I would have this nice thing, I would bang for the second round now, boom. So we can proceed. Katri, the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much. And yes, there was a question on the Finnish sort of foreign and security policy as part of the Nordic region, and I did some quick research on research topics or the publications that we have had, and it is very clear from, let's say, starting from 2016, 2017, that there was I wouldn't say consensus, but I think many researchers shared this idea that with the Nordic countries, we have a different network of different partnerships, each country having the sort of specific choices of Norway being a NATO member and Finland, Sweden not being in the NATO, etc., etc. But this didn't prevent the countries from cooperating and developing a lot of different regional initiatives, not directly linked with the military issues, but more in a comprehensive security style. So about the Nordic networks of different institutions that have been very active. Then in 2016, as part of a bigger project, I wrote with a colleague a paper where we looked into this Russian kind of way of looking at the Russia's strategic environment, and argued that perhaps Russia sees this network of different actors in the Baltic Sea and Nordic region as something that has a lot of loopholes on it, that kind of increases the risk potential rather than decreases it, in a sense that we had a lot of different levels of agencies that perhaps didn't create this common view on the priority of the threats. And so we have other researchers writing in 2018 that, well, this Nordic cooperation is informal, it's fragmented, there's no clear political guidance on what to kind of focus on. But then another research 4 years later, in January 22, so 1 year ago, based on a lot of interviews with the politicians and researchers in the different Nordic countries, comes to a conclusion that at the moment we have a more coherent view on strategic environment, etc., etc. And then during this kind of massive phase of the Russia's war against Ukraine, there are these very clear statements in support of Ukraine, and also making it clear that the Nordic countries plus the UK, the Nordic 8, has a in a way similar approach to what's going on. And of course, here the biggest change is with Sweden, but also of course with Finland, with the decision to apply for the NATO membership. And just following what Captain Шу you mentioned in different contexts, but I think there was the very important notion that also I think explains this big change in the Nordic security constellation, that it was understood that we are with the existential struggle for sovereignty also here, that the war against Ukraine has this, the kind of threshold has been broken, and that Russia's, in a way, as they were made very clear before the war, that the appetite is much larger. So this is the big factor that changed people's mind in a way towards NATO, because it is interesting and it is important to understand that for the Finnish kind of general public, it is the EU that is seen as a major security provider, and our way of speaking about the EU has been from the very beginning, from the 1995, that the EU is the kind of actor that is it's part of the security solution for Finland to be member of the EU, and thereby until last year, the NATO has been during the long years in the popular surveys has been less. It has been seen as a less positive actor in this sphere, and there is the huge change now of course, and as I said, it is with the realization that this is for the small country neighboring Russia. It's an existential struggle. But then about the Nordic countries, the discussion that has been also mentioned by several studies is that their focus on the security issues in these political and expert discussions is on Baltic Sea region security, then the Arctic security, and then the Nordic proper, and now with this new alignment, it is perhaps seen that as a contribution to general European security, but also in a way seeing problems coming in next several years in the Arctic region as well. But I think that when it comes to the Russia's war against Ukraine, there is very strong commitment from the Nordic countries. Maybe at this point, I would also like to comment shortly one idea from Captain Шу. You mentioned you started with the idea of Russia as a third option, and this is in this East Pacific region, and this is something that Russia has been like really cultivating with its foreign policy elites and foreign policy thinking. Before the war, there was this several sort of foreign policy papers or reports written that Russia wants to build a new non-aligned new movement as an alternative and as a base for kind of producing its sort of increasing its status in the world that it sees as a bilateral or this kind of struggle between US and China. And now, of course, there's a new language talking about the non-West as a countries that Russia leans on, and it is just interesting how they can kind of keep up with this language and with this, in a way, tap into these misperceptions and perceptions of Russia that exist in the world. And this is perhaps also a comment to Solomia's earlier speech, that I think one of the basic problems we are having, and it's something that is very we Finns are very familiar with, is the fact that there is not enough information about Ukraine there around the world. So it is very important work that you do. I remember we have a kind of saying in Finland that yes, we go to Europe, as if we would be somehow outside of it, and this nurturing this idea of Ukraine as part of Europe is super important. But then how to, in a way, same time create this, to replace this misperception of Russia with the audiences that are not necessarily very receptive of this information. It's a really tough thing to do, but something that is really important. Maybe I stop here again. If you have some extra questions on the Nordic
yes, I would like to ask,
issue.
Katri, if I may ask you one brief question, so that we have enough time for Captain Xu and for Solomia to say. Maybe it is like a stupid question, a bit amusing, because what we heard in Ukraine, that Russia threatened Finland and Sweden that if you just decide to join NATO, we will, we will do something, we will not tell you what, but we will threaten you. And I do remember even with you once we discussed, when and thank you for that, you joined our discussion, that Finns and Swedes discussed, and the United States provided guarantees for this process until Sweden and Finland joins NATO. So how was that threat by Russia perceived? And maybe a second very swift question, because it's great to have you with us. Well heard about this minister comment that maybe Finland should join NATO without Sweden. If that, because that is definitely the aftermath of Russian aggression against Ukraine, if that is discussed, that there might be some split between the Nordic countries who goes first. So questions about threats from Russia, don't do this if it was seriously perceived. And secondly, if there is any split between Sweden and Finland, if Finland joins first without Sweden.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, of course, there were this immediate reaction from Russia, and already before there were this threats that if Finland ever considers, it is then considered as an aggressor in a way, like very typical style. But it's the military technical response that can be whatever, but most likely it is new kind of grouping of the forces, although now it's really empty next to our border, because unfortunately everything is concentrated on against Ukraine. But that's going to what is expected. There is some attempts to create sort of a information influence, but since this decision is very consensus based, you can't really see any cracks in. That's the Finnish way, that first we have always tried to preserve consensus in the foreign policy matters, which is one of the reasons why it was difficult to have this discussion. There was this idea of NATO option that has been now used, but there were no really genuine discussion about the military alignment in like, let's say, mid 2000s in Finland. About this, how to proceed now with this process, I think there is now more open discussion on possibility that we proceed earlier than Sweden, but it's also made very clear that the best what is favorable for the both countries would be to do this and enter at the same time, but unfortunately it's not on our hands at the moment.
Thank you, Katri. Thank you for your contribution. And as promised, we now move to Captain Xu. The question was, maybe you would also elaborate more on it, how we Ukrainians can have our voices heard in Southeast Asia, different countries, maybe a couple of examples, or maybe you also came up with some ideas listening to contributions of other panelists. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Maxim. I think that's a really, really important and interesting question. And really, I just want to really emphasize something that Katri said at the end of her talk, which is that people here just needs to know more about Ukraine, that it's about exposure. And the thing is that, you know, in Southeast Asia, being in the Pacific region, right, they're kind of on the margins of NATO, of the North Atlantic. And so you're talking about the other side of the world, and so many people here never had any interactions with any Ukrainians. They never had any exposure to Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian history. Of course, many of them really don't have that much exposure to Russian history and Russian culture. But for that matter, you know, there's more a cultural salience of Russia, just given its geopolitical position in global politics. And so I think really what needs to happen is cultural diplomacy. So especially the types of work that, you know, Solomia, you're doing, I think, of course, the onus has to be on many different cultural institutions, from academia to civil society to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to really kind of expand the worldview and Ukraine's position in world history. And just speaking from a personal perspective, you know, my students will know that once I really learned about Ukrainian history, once I really started to delve into my research, for instance, on genocide, I can make no pretense about my position, because, you know, one of the first things I learned when I study post-Soviet geography and genocide studies is, of course, the Holodomor, that the atrocities that Russia is committing in Ukraine has historical precedence, that this is not the first time that the Russian state is perpetrating mass violence in Ukraine. And so it is really through that understanding, and of course through my own exposure, having deployed to Central and Eastern Europe in 2014 after the invasion of Crimea, that I personally really started to feel the cultural salience, feel those feelings of empathy, compassion, and connection to the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation. And I think that's the key here. It's a lot of times, I think, maybe in these sort of academic discussions, I think we tend to think more high level, more theoretical. But speaking from my own personal experience, I really believe what it takes is just human-to-human interaction, human-to-human exposure, that we need to humanize Ukrainians so that Ukraine as a nation isn't just some abstract concept for people here to hear about in the news. Because if that's the case, then all these competing narratives can fill people's heads, especially given, you know, the prevalence of Russian disinformation campaigns all over social media. Using the example of the Philippines, just because it's the case that I'm most familiar with, the Philippines is perhaps the most online population in the world. Almost everybody in the Philippines is on Facebook, which is the predominant social media platform. And we've seen exactly how powerful disinformation campaigns can be on social media, particularly how Russian influencing have really shaped people's perceptions and opinions through the use of troll farms on Facebook. And this is something that the Philippines as a society is extremely vulnerable to. So I think what's a viable strategy to counter that is to engage in digital diplomacy. I think one of the the things that President Zelensky did very, very well was to really booster his own presence on social media, really using these digital platforms as a means to communicate his message, as a way to spread information and really talk to not only a domestic audience, but a broader international audience. So then what's required when you do cultural diplomacy and digital diplomacy strategies is that strategic advocacy needs to be targeted. It needs to resonate with the audience that you're seeking to engage. And I really think that is the key here, is to for instance, when trying to communicate aspects of Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture, I think there's a lot of parallels to be drawn between Ukrainian history in the context of being in the shadow of the Soviet Union to many of the countries in Southeast Asia. Cambodia, immediately comes to mind, especially given some of their experiences during the Khmer Rouge regime, which the Cambodian people have suffered really, really a lot. And I think, that could be a bridge building point between the Ukrainian and the Cambodian people. And just on this point of kind of cultural diplomacy in Cambodia, I actually just came across this article where I think actually one of your colleagues, I think his name is Alexei Haran, was actually just in Cambodia giving a talk about this almost exactly what we're doing. And I think his presentation in Cambodia is really doing a great service in communicating and in introducing Ukraine to the Cambodians who have, for the most part, kind of maintained this stance of lukewarmness in terms of their neutrality, so to speak. And in fact, I think it was something like 2 days ago, the Russian envoy in Cambodia was just praising Cambodia for their stance of neutrality. But I think after Alexei's presentation, I think that actually started to change the narrative a lot. And it's because I think the Russian voices in Southeast Asia have just been more pervasive, that there wasn't really the space for the Ukrainian counter narrative. And I think this is the opportunity, because I think there's a hunger for this. I think people want to know. They just need to be given the opportunity to get to know Ukraine, to get to know Ukrainians, to get to know Ukrainian culture, and why it is that for Ukraine, it is not only an obligation to counter Russian aggression, but it's absolutely existential. So I think that's just my kind of contribution to that question.
Thank you, Captain Xu. I have another question, maybe related to that, because I forgot to ask this one, but I'm still, I have it on my mind, and because before I pass the word to Solomia, and I know that she will talk a lot, and I will definitely not interrupt her, but then I would need to have your answer, your answer to the question, because you did great job for passing the word to Solomia regarding the how to make Ukrainian voices heard about the academic work, and Professor Haran really does a great job. Before that, he went with the Ukrainian Society representatives to African nations, where he also talked and tried to find academic ties. My department, we're now working with 2 universities, one in Ghana, another one in Kenya, build academic ties, and I have a dream of having African studies, Central African Studies program at my Department of International Relations. That would be very useful. But before we go to this, like deeply to that one, it's nice that you said about it's all about exposure, being able to speak to living Ukrainians who visit these countries, and it's also about using digital platforms to bring our narratives and to find spaces, you said, for Ukrainian counter narratives because of the pervasive presence of the Russian narratives. But coming back to your previous contribution, because I would still like to have the United States into the picture, just to maybe your comment, of course, because you mentioned it as well, and Russia does it all the time, presenting this war, not the Russian war against Ukraine, but Russian war with the collective West and with the United States. And this is, of course, how we Ukrainians communicate our message. Because imagine I come to Philippines or Cambodia or something and say, no, it's not about you, Ukraine. Russia is fighting with the United States, and they're using you as a kind of proxy. So is it like that? Is that perception there? This was some parts of society in Southeast Asia, or is Russia losing that argument?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, Maxim, and I think that's a brilliant observation. That perception absolutely is there. In fact, recently I saw an op-ed in a local newspaper, and the title, I can't remember, but it went something like, is the US going to make Philippines its Asian Ukraine, or something like that. And that speaks directly to this perception that you're talking about here, is that it really is seen as this kind of proxy war by some segments, not all, but by some segments of society here. And a lot of it, and I'm sad to say, really kind of almost comes from this perception of hypocrisy from the Americans, because a lot of people here have really, really vivid memories still of American aggression in the region. So especially when we talk about Vietnam and Cambodia, in the Philippines, a lot of people, especially in the southern parts of the country, still hold a lot of resentment over US colonization here. And so I think a lot of it also has to do that, you know, for the West, in order for them to conduct sort of their cultural diplomacy to counter some of these narratives, I think this focus on human rights really needs to, they also have to do a little bit of reflection, I think, on some of their foreign policies, both in the past, as well as perhaps even in some people's minds today. And that I think the way that you kind of framed it, I think actually you can almost flip this narrative around if you want to try to build bridges and try to really connect with people here. It's that by saying that, well, if you were to think to a time when, you know, these societies here, so in the Philippines, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, have endured aggression from another power, you know, whether that's the US, whether that's Spain, whether that's Japan, or whether that's China now, I think you could then understand how perhaps Ukrainians feel when they are therefore caught under the shadow of a much greater and more aggressive power, which really seeks to have designs over Ukraine's ability for self-determination, as well as sovereignty. And I think when you frame it like that, in terms of sovereignty and self-determination, that's a message that really, really resonates here. Because a lot of the countries here have pretty fresh memories and take a lot of pride in their independence struggles. And I think that is the area where Ukraine can really, really connect. And it's really just to frame it as Ukraine is undergoing its independence struggle right now as we speak. This is not an experience that is, you know, unique to Ukraine in terms of anti-imperialism. This is an experience that Vietnam went through, Cambodia went through, Laos went through, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. Every country in Southeast Asia has gone through this anti-imperial struggle that Ukraine is currently engaged in right now.
Thank you very much, because I think, yes, anti-imperial struggle is something the countries are familiar with, and this is how we could put our message. Because I tried that, and I published an article in a Polish journal on Africa, that African nations had also this experience of fighting back or against imperialism. Thank you very much, because I would hate now to summarize your second part, because definitely Solomia and us have a lot to say, and we spoke about how made Ukrainian voices heard and about that, and Solomia also promised us to tell about the academia in terms of culture diplomacy and things like that. So Solomia, I'm not stealing your time now, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maxim. And I'm eager also to build upon what have been said. I'll start with the Ukrainian studies, those just to share what we know. We have actually just finalized 1 month ago the research, the big survey on the Ukrainian studies centers all over the globe. And we have found that there are a lot, 160 at least, but they are quite of a different type, often not institutionalized. And one of the biggest problems is that it hasn't been decolonized. So if you have, for example, and I'm saying about the Ukrainian studies usually as a part of the Eastern European studies, and it's no news for you that mostly 90% of what have been researched is Russia. And this is something that Ukraine will work a lot, we and other people, that above all, the Eastern European studies should be decolonized. Also, Russian focus should be reconsidered. It doesn't mean that the world doesn't need to research. We should know. But we also need to really be very strict on what do you study? Slovakia, Slovenia, Poland, Ukraine, Russia. Unfortunately, it has been very much abused all over the last decades. Another finding is that Crimean Tatar studies are absolutely not related to the Ukrainian studies yet. And that's our objective for the next 10 years. It should be considered as one. As politically, linguistically, of course, this is a Turkish language. And by the way, the Crimean Tatar studies are mostly linguistical. It was the beginning 100 years ago for the Ukrainian studies. We all remember, linguistic studies. So that is fine. But this does not suffice now, right? And that is something that we'll work on as well. And the last, I think the last challenge for us is that why I'm saying it's not institutionalized. We all know HURI, the Harvard Ukrainian Studies Center. We know the Cambridge Rory Finn, absolutely impressive initiative and so on. But these are numbers. Ukraine being quite a big country in Europe and having quite a rich, history, just does not suffice, because what I mean institutionalized, to work with departments on their course for students, on the master programs and so on. It is not that developed as we would like to, really. And as I said, just to show you the example, for you to understand, this is absolutely normal to be a PhD student now in Germany and to get a feedback from your professor and saying, well, listen, you cannot explore and research the Ukrainian culture without Russian lens. It's absolutely epistemological nonsense. And for that, you will not get cancel, #cancel. No, it's absolutely normal, so far so good. And we need to understand how in which basic, level we still are. So we need to question a lot of professors, and it doesn't mean we need to cancel them, but we need to question their approaches as well. Because if your professor says listen, this doesn't work, rewrite your proposal, rewrite your first chapter in the PhD, it changes how the knowledge of productions is being made. In coming back to what you have said about the world in general, I think this decolonizing lens that has been developed most in Africa, in Southeast Asia over the last decades, it's something that we need to take over, not take over, but use some findings from that for Ukraine. Also understanding there are some particularities for Ukraine. What we usually get as the first response from Southeast Asia, from India, from Indian colleagues, is that no, you don't know what is to be colony. And this is something, if there is this argument at the discussion, this is a literal quote from my conversation, the conversation stops, right? But you need to, again, to develop, what does this person mean? What do we mean by the empire? The Western academia and generally global academia is used to how we perceive empire is something overseas, some state that has overseas colonies. Well, Ukraine is clearly not overseas colonies, but it doesn't make us not colony. We need to question the whole epistemological apparatus of how we think about the empire. And we need to do that in Ukraine and maybe with some other colleagues from Eastern Europe. It is absolutely common for me to find in the summaries from the discourse analysis in the Southeast Asia is that in India, I must say this, something that I quote is in India, that, well, but, you know, Russian and Ukrainians are effectively one nation, blah, 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 blah. And it is still assumed as something, as a common language. And this is something we need to question. Having said that, I need to also for us to warn all of us in Ukraine, and that's something that also influences our approaches, is that we cannot talk to people who have the experience of being a colony without any references to their history. It's just non-respect. It's showing non-respect. And coming back to our famine, the genocide has been acknowledged for Holodomor by quite many countries, actually, but not all over the world. But when you talk about this famine to the Indian people, for example, they do not say, oh, how sorry we are for you. They start from something else. They start from, but you celebrate Churchill, somebody who inflicted the Bengali famine for us. You know, and when so this something that I learned in 2022 very strictly for myself about all and for my team is that if you start and if you want to show what is Ukraine is going now through, you need also to acknowledge that above all learn, but then to acknowledge to that person, I know your experience. I might not understand everything, but please let's talk us what we have in common. Again, about the coloniality as in general, we Ukrainians don't have the experience of the racism experience in our experience of colonization. When we say we have been colony, a lot of people say, but you're white, what are you talking, you know? And they are absolutely right. We don't have an experience of having non-white, generally non-white skin, even though I know there are essays and public essays about Eastern European having gray skin. It's another discussion now, right? It's just not that. We don't have that experience of being Black, for example, in the US, and we need to acknowledge it if we want to speak to people and expect them to listen to us and hear us out at least. And just to finish about practically now, for you to know what we are doing, we are clearly going out of Europe. So the focus will be Europe and Northern America for sure, but for the next 2 years, and wish us good luck, we'll work a lot on Southeast Asia, on Africa and Latin America. There are 10 countries: Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, India, Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, Argentina, Mexico, Brazil. It's something that we need to work to have project with. Again, it's about, focusing. You cannot cover everything. What our experience also says, just to build up on what have been said, really, human people's stories makes difference. Also, what really works a lot it's about this postcards from Ukraine. This is a project that we had, and we still have it, like showing for example, the cultural house somewhere in Kharkiv, and then it was bombed, and like 2 pictures, how the destruction actually changes the space. And this works very well for, at least from the experience of my colleague Alim Aliyev, who was with Alexei Haran in Indonesia last week. This works a lot. When we, I think it's very much universal human trait. When we see destruction, and when we understand that, no, this hasn't been a military base of the US. This has been a cultural center for kids. It changes a lot of perspective for most of people that we met and showed that. I'm shutting up because I'll be then critiqued by Maxim.
No, but maybe Solomia, because this is something very practical. Maybe you can tell us what is that exactly from your perspective? What resources, apart from knowledge, this is very good because I approached, I'm so sorry to hear that Ghana is not on your list because there are two universities we're established in contact with. One is Riara University in Kenya, and the other one is the Central University in Accra in Ghana. So maybe Ghana will also join your list. But maybe from your perspective and from your experience, what do you think we in Ukraine lack, apart from knowledge about these countries, to be able to build ties with them? For example, because we have Captain Xu with us, maybe he would also advise us something on that issue with regard to the Southeast Asia. And maybe also Katri will also reflect something on, from your perspective, what information about Ukraine is missing in the Nordic countries, for example, or what kind of presence would be needed, okay? So Solomia, my question to you is, what exactly we Ukrainians need to have our voice heard and to, you know, to put it, apart from knowledge about the countries, maybe something else is needed?
So I'll be critical. I'm always critical of ourselves. Just there have been some survey that I found, and it appears that the Western Europeans are having higher level of empathy than Ukrainians. Maybe it's because of so many wars and suffering. I don't know. But in order to talk to people who also have suffering experience, you need to have empathy. Of course, and I remember Susan Sontag's essay on photography, and you cannot never compare pains of others. Like, it's just like, it's nonsense. But just your own approach as a professional, as any person from Ukraine being a diplomat himself or herself, have empathy to what you're listening to. And also, noticed about the China as the biggest threat in Southeast Asia, we also need to understand how the dynamics, for example, in Africa works, and the One Road and Belt Initiative that is changing Africa absolutely. And if you really listen to those people, like, and you're like, you would like, from the Ukrainian perspective, why would you want to cooperate with China? It's like, it just doesn't make sense. It's autocratic countries. No, but listen up. The cooperation, the companies from the West brought about quite little benefits for those local communities. Let's acknowledge also a lot of that. And if you know more about what the countries, like especially big countries, I don't like to call it superpowers anymore, but especially big countries, what they are doing in the regions, you will understand the dynamics, regional politics as well, which will help you to kind of to suggest what we as Ukraine can do as well.
Great. Now, either Captain Xu or Katri, who of you would like to follow up on that a bit?
Well, if I go first, like previously. Thank you for the question on what information or knowledge of Ukraine is missing. I'm not perhaps have the total knowledge of Finland, but my perception is that we as a country, for historical reasons, as I explained, have also very much focused on everything to do with Russia. So and this has to be balanced now. And I think just we at the University of Helsinki, and Maxim has been teaching there. It's been we have the Ukrainian studies kind of courses, but it's not. It's quite small in size to for example what is taught on Russia. So just history, culture, literature, everything related to Ukraine is, I think, is needed. But as I mentioned already, there is this very basic understanding in Finland that our fate as a nation is similar to Ukraine, even if we are like a super small in size in comparison to Ukraine. So in that sense, can't be compared. But and of course the history has been very, very different. But there is this general It was very nice that you have mentioned the idea of empathy. I think that is very important. It helps us to orient, even if we can't guarantee or rely on it too much, but it has to be as part of one element in this cultural exchange, cultural understanding. And that of course Finnish people have a lot now towards Ukraine, and therefore, but we need the more sort of a basic understanding, and there of course the role of universities and role of scholars is very important, and as well as different cultural actors. We have a very active community of Ukrainian society, Ukrainians living in Finland. So that's the engine in many of the events. Thank you. I think I stop here.
Thank you, Katri. It's always nice and flattering to hear that academic community and we university professors are important. It's always nice to hear that. Thank you for bringing that point. Captain Shu, we were slowly approaching the end of our conversation. We've been here for 2 hours already. Maybe your kind of final remarks before I sum up our discussion, please.
Yeah, thank you. And I really don't think I can say it more beautifully than what Solomia and Katri have already put in terms of what is needed to and what knowledge about Ukraine is missing. But I really want to emphasize this point that I think Solomia made, is the importance of understanding regional context and how to make, therefore, the message resonate with the audience. You really highlighted, and this really resonated with me, the pitfalls of just one-to-one comparisons, of comparing one historical experience that's situated within a particular set of circumstances with another historical experience, of course, situated in a different set of circumstances. And I think when we can understand the nuance, it's not, then we can kind of get into that human-to-human level interaction where it's not about who suffered more, who was, supporting perpetrators in one instance due to some geopolitical reason versus another, but instead just to say, we suffer as human beings, we recognize your suffering, and we are now asking for you to recognize our suffering. And I think really to make that message resonate, it's to make it cultural and contextually specific, particularly in the Southeast Asian case. One of the things that, of course, you'll immediately recognize when you start to engage in these sort of cultural work here in this particular region is that there are so many, because as I mentioned, society is so fractured and there's so many cleavages, there are a lot of domestic issues that that institutions and politicians have to consider here in order to keep their coalitions together, in order to keep societal coalitions together, which at many points are very fragile. So in a lot of these situations, I think from their perspective, it could feel like we have so much to deal with domestically that we are even barely just staying afloat, that now to consider and to support and perhaps to even divert resources to another conflict in a faraway land seems like a bridge too far for us. But I think it doesn't even need to go to that level, right? I think cultural diplomacy can start with something extremely basic, and that's just to get to know who we are and get to know the situation that we are in. And simply to establish that dialogue through these joint academic endeavors, through outreach, and just through kind of a program delivery at a very basic level, I think that's like the perfect place to start. And even just to have digital content that's very low friction for people to access in a local language, in a local dialect, is going to make a massive difference. So I think we start small, we start specific, and then gradually scale that up to increase the scope of that type of dialogue.
Captain Шу, I like the Finnish line saying to increase the scope of dialogue. I think this is something you'll need, because we have like 5 minutes left. I would like to do a brief summary because there are no questions in the chat, but we have so many questions to discuss anyway. I like that but basically, because we have this 1 year of full-scale war and Russian invasion now, I like that we started from the threats and threats perception and moved into something positive, because, making plans for the future, how Ukraine will open a dozen of new embassies in Africa, and how we will make our voices heard in Southeast Asia. It's all about that Ukraine will win this war, and we will develop and make new friends and new contacts. So I think that is very positive, and this is something we at times lack here in Ukraine, to have this positive view. But in the other way, as Solomia said, to be able critical about the resources, understanding local context. And understanding local context is basically what Katri and Cheng helped us with today, bringing their perspectives from their respective part of the world, and also telling us what are the challenges and what are the problems there. And I think everybody up to now, everybody who listened to our discussion, it was partly broadcasted, and we'll have it posted on the School for Policy Analysis resources. I think the main idea that I can break with this discussion is that in order to have our voices heard, we also need to understand the people who we are talking to, the nations, the context, the countries, to make comparison. I've heard from one psychologist that it's not about, get to know yourself. There is like, this is good, but understanding another person is even more complicated. Understanding other nations and their context is also a difficult task to do, but we are sure that Ukrainians now scattered throughout the globe, many refugees and things like that, we can definitely understand that. So I think I will not steal everybody's time more, because I said only 5 minutes left. I would like to use this opportunity to thank our participants for finding time, for joining us. I think we can also do something like making some materials or short transcripts of the main contributions. Maybe for Solomia and the Ukraine Institute will develop even policy recommendations out of our discussion. How to do that and how to proceed, that would be nice. We can do that, to have not that just we met and exchange ideas, but that we have these ideas in terms of policy recommendations. That would be lovely. And I definitely invite Katri and Cheng and Solomia also to join other discussions, and both by the Association of Political Science Students, who did a great job of getting us together, and also with the School for Policy Analysis of Kilmer Hill Academy. Maybe we'll come up in the future with some other projects, discussion, and topics, so you're warmly welcome to join. Having said that, you see I'm sparing all us some time. I think we can now have a nice afternoon, us all, and I really hope that we are going to see each other, even sometimes in person, hopefully, and to have further discussions. Thank you, Katri. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Panelist and moderator. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a good
Bye.
day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.